When we study the complexities of imperial Rome, we encounter human experiences that challenge our understanding of power, trauma, and psychological development. Today, we'll examine a deeply troubling historical case that reveals how absolute power can distort human relationships and perpetuate cycles of harm across generations. The Roman Empire, at its height, concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of individuals who were often ill-equipped to wield it responsibly. These emperors lived in isolation from normal human experience, surrounded by those who either feared them or sought to manipulate them. Within this context, we find patterns of behavior that modern psychology helps us understand, though we must approach these historical accounts with both scholarly rigor and deep sensitivity for all those affected. Historical sources, primarily Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, document concerning patterns within imperial families. These accounts, while potentially influenced by political motivations and literary conventions, provide glimpses into private lives that were shaped by trauma, unlimited power, and the absence of normal social constraints. When examining these historical accounts, we must consider how childhood trauma within imperial families created lasting psychological patterns. Children born into imperial households experienced a reality fundamentally different from normal human development. They were simultaneously privileged beyond measure and profoundly isolated from authentic human connection. Every relationship was potentially political, every interaction filtered through the lens of imperial power. The psychological impact of such an upbringing cannot be overstated. Modern trauma research helps us understand how early experiences of powerlessness, combined with later acquisition of absolute power, can create destructive behavioral patterns. These individuals often struggle to form healthy relationships, viewing others through the distorted lens of their own traumatic experiences. Archaeological evidence from imperial residences reveals the physical environment in which these psychological patterns developed. The vast, marble-clad spaces of imperial palaces were designed to emphasize power and hierarchy, not human warmth or connection. Private quarters were separated from public spaces by elaborate protocols that further isolated rulers from normal human interaction. Within this context, we must approach the specific case that brings us here today with both historical accuracy and profound respect for all those whose lives were affected. The accounts suggest a pattern of behavior so disturbing that even ancient historians, accustomed to imperial excess, found it remarkable enough to document. The imperial family in question exemplifies how trauma can perpetuate across generations, creating cycles of harm that affect not just immediate family members, but entire imperial courts, and, ultimately, the broader Roman world. Understanding these patterns requires examining both the documented behaviors and the systemic factors that enabled them. Historical accounts describe a family structure fundamentally disrupted by political violence and personal trauma. The future emperor's early years were marked by instability, loss, and exposure to violence that would have profound psychological consequences. Modern understanding of attachment theory and trauma responses helps us comprehend how these early experiences shaped later behavioral patterns. The relationship between the emperor and his mother represents one of the most psychologically complex dynamics documented in imperial history. Ancient sources describe a bond that transcended normal parent-child relationships, evolving into something that contemporary observers found deeply troubling. This relationship appears to have been characterized by both profound emotional dependence and destructive power struggles. When examining the documented patterns, we see evidence of what modern psychology might recognize as trauma bonding, intense emotional connections formed through shared experiences of powerlessness and survival. The emperor's mother had survived political purges, exile, and the constant threat of execution. These experiences created a relationship dynamic based on mutual dependence and shared trauma rather than healthy familial love. The emperor's later romantic relationships must be understood within this psychological framework. Historical accounts suggest he sought partners who reminded him of his mother, creating relationships that recreated familiar but unhealthy emotional patterns. This behavior pattern, while deeply troubling, reflects the psychological reality of how untreated trauma can shape adult relationships. Ancient historians document specific instances where the emperor's romantic choices appeared deliberately designed to recreate aspects of his relationship with his mother. These accounts, while potentially exaggerated for literary effect, suggest a pattern of behavior that contemporary observers found remarkable even within the context of imperial excess. The psychological isolation of imperial life further complicated these relationship patterns. Surrounded by individuals who were either terrified of him or seeking to manipulate him, the emperor had limited opportunities for genuine human connection. This isolation may have intensified his need to recreate familiar relationship dynamics, even when those dynamics were fundamentally unhealthy. We must also consider how the emperor's mother's own traumatic experiences shaped her parenting. Having survived multiple political purges and threats to her life, she likely developed survival strategies that prioritized control and manipulation over emotional nurturing. These patterns would have profoundly affected her son's psychological development. The documented relationship patterns suggest a family system where normal boundaries were consistently violated, where political survival was prioritized over emotional health, and where the normal processes of psychological development were disrupted by the demands of imperial life. Understanding these patterns helps us comprehend not just individual behavior, but the broader systemic factors that enabled such dysfunction. Archaeological evidence from imperial residences provides additional context for understanding these relationship dynamics. Private quarters were designed to facilitate complete privacy and control, creating spaces where normal social constraints were absent. These physical spaces enabled behaviors that would have been impossible in more public or regulated environments. The intersection of unlimited political power with deeply damaged psychological patterns created a situation where normal human relationships became impossible. The emperor's romantic life, as documented by ancient historians, reveals how absolute power can corrupt even the most intimate human connections. Historical accounts describe romantic relationships characterized by extreme control, possessiveness, and what appears to be deliberate recreation of maternal relationship patterns. These relationships were marked by the emperor's apparent need to dominate completely while simultaneously recreating the emotional dynamics of his relationship with his mother. The individuals who became romantically involved with the emperor found themselves in positions of extraordinary privilege and profound vulnerability. While they gained access to imperial wealth and status, they also became subject to the emperor's psychological needs and controlling behaviors. Their agency was fundamentally compromised by the vast power differential and the emperor's apparent psychological instability. Ancient sources suggest that the emperor's romantic partners were chosen specifically for their resemblance to his mother, both physically and in personality. This pattern suggests a deep psychological need to recreate familiar relationship dynamics, even when those dynamics were inherently unhealthy. The emperor appears to have been unable to form relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The documented behaviors within these relationships reveal the corrupting influence of absolute power on human connection. Normal processes of negotiation, compromise, and mutual consideration became impossible when one partner held the power of life and death over the other. What might have appeared as romantic devotion was actually a form of psychological control enabled by imperial authority. Court observers, as recorded in historical accounts, noted the disturbing nature of these relationships. Even within a cultural context that accepted significant power imbalances in romantic relationships, the emperor's behavior was considered extreme. This suggests that the psychological patterns went beyond culturally normative power dynamics into territory that contemporaries recognized as unhealthy. The emperor's need to control every aspect of his partners' lives extended to their appearance, behavior, social interactions, and even their expressions of emotion. This level of control suggests deep psychological insecurity combined with unlimited means to enforce compliance. The partners in these relationships existed primarily to meet the emperor's psychological needs, rather than being valued as independent individuals. Historical accounts document instances where the emperor's romantic partners were expected to participate in elaborate role-playing scenarios designed to recreate aspects of his relationship with his mother. These accounts, while potentially exaggerated by hostile historians, suggest a pattern of using romantic relationships to address unresolved psychological trauma. The broader court system enabled these destructive relationship patterns by creating an environment where no one felt safe challenging the emperor's behavior. Advisors, guards, and court officials who might have intervened in healthier political systems were themselves subject to the emperor's power and feared for their own safety. This systemic enablement allowed destructive patterns to continue and escalate. We must also consider the impact on the romantic partners themselves, who were expected to navigate these complex and dangerous relationship dynamics while maintaining their own psychological health. Historical accounts suggest that some developed sophisticated survival strategies, while others appear to have been psychologically damaged by the experience. The documentation of these relationship patterns provides insight into how unlimited power can corrupt human connection at the most intimate level. When normal social constraints and mutual accountability are absent, relationships can become vehicles for reenacting trauma rather than sources of healing and growth. The individual psychological patterns we've examined cannot be understood apart from the broader imperial system that enabled and perpetuated them. The emperor's destructive behaviors were not simply personal failings, but symptoms of systemic problems within Roman imperial governance and society. The imperial succession system created conditions that virtually guaranteed psychological damage to future rulers. Children designated as heirs were isolated from normal social development, surrounded by individuals with competing political agendas, and raised with the expectation that they would one day wield absolute power. This system prioritized political continuity over the psychological health of individuals who would later govern the empire. Court culture further enabled destructive behaviors by creating an environment where challenging the emperor was potentially fatal. Advisors who might have provided healthy boundaries or psychological insight were instead focused on survival and advancement. This created a feedback loop where unhealthy behaviors were not only unchecked, but actively enabled by those around the emperor. The broader Roman social system, with its acceptance of extreme power imbalances and limited recognition of individual rights, provided the cultural context within which these behaviors could occur. While the emperor's actions were extreme even by Roman standards, they existed on a continuum of accepted power dynamics rather than representing a complete break from cultural norms. Economic factors also played a role in enabling destructive behaviors. The imperial system concentrated vast wealth in the hands of a single individual, providing unlimited resources to indulge psychological needs and desires. This economic power eliminated practical constraints that might have limited destructive behaviors in individuals with less access to resources. The geographic isolation of imperial residences created physical spaces where normal social oversight was absent. These carefully controlled environments enabled behaviors that would have been impossible in more public or regulated settings. The design of imperial palaces prioritized the emperor's complete control over his environment rather than healthy social interaction. Military and security systems, designed to protect the emperor from external threats, also served to isolate him from internal accountability. The Praetorian Guard and other security forces were loyal to the emperor personally, rather than to broader institutional structures, creating a situation where those with the physical power to intervene were actually invested in maintaining the status quo. The legal system under imperial rule eliminated most mechanisms for holding the emperor accountable for personal behavior. Unlike republican institutions that provided some checks on individual power, the imperial system concentrated legal authority in the person of the emperor, making it virtually impossible to address abuse of power through institutional means. Religious and cultural institutions that might have provided moral guidance were instead co-opted by imperial power. Rather than serving as independent sources of ethical authority, religious leaders and cultural figures became dependent on imperial patronage, compromising their ability to provide moral leadership when it was most needed. The broader implications of these systemic failures extended far beyond the imperial court. When the individual with ultimate authority demonstrated destructive behavioral patterns, it normalized similar behaviors throughout the imperial hierarchy. Provincial governors, military commanders, and local officials often modeled their behavior on imperial examples, creating cascading effects throughout the empire. The documented behaviors also had profound effects on Roman society's understanding of power, relationships, and human dignity. When the most powerful individual in the known world demonstrated that unlimited power could be used to exploit and control others, it reinforced cultural acceptance of power-based relationship dynamics at all levels of society. Historical analysis reveals how these individual psychological patterns and systemic enablers combined to create periods of political instability and social dysfunction. The emperor's personal behaviors contributed to broader political crises that affected millions of people throughout the empire, demonstrating how individual psychological health and political stability are intimately connected. Our examination of this troubling historical case provides important insights into the intersection of power, psychology, and human dignity that remain relevant today. While the specific context of imperial Rome is historically unique, the underlying patterns of how unlimited power can corrupt human relationships and perpetuate cycles of harm transcend historical periods. Modern psychological research validates many of the patterns we observe in these historical accounts. Understanding trauma responses, attachment disorders, and the psychological effects of isolation helps us comprehend behaviors that ancient historians documented but couldn't fully explain. This intersection of historical analysis and contemporary psychological knowledge deepens our understanding of both past and present. The systematic enablement of destructive behaviors provides crucial lessons about institutional accountability and the importance of checks on individual power. The Roman example demonstrates how even well-intentioned systems can fail when they prioritize stability and continuity over individual rights and human dignity. These lessons remain relevant for contemporary discussions about power, accountability, and institutional design. Perhaps most importantly, our examination reveals the profound human cost of systems that fail to protect vulnerable individuals. The romantic partners, court officials, and others affected by the emperor's behaviors were real people whose lives were fundamentally shaped by these traumatic experiences. Their stories remind us that historical analysis must always center human dignity and the real impact of political systems on individual lives. The documentation of these events by ancient historians also provides insight into the role of historical memory in processing collective trauma. The fact that these behaviors were recorded, discussed, and analyzed by contemporary observers suggests a societal recognition that something profound was wrong, even when institutional mechanisms for addressing the problems were absent. Our responsibility as students of history includes approaching these difficult topics with both scholarly rigor and profound respect for all those affected. We study these patterns not to sensationalize human suffering, but to understand how systems can fail and how we might build better institutions that protect human dignity while maintaining effective governance. The intersection of individual psychology and political power remains relevant in contemporary contexts. Understanding how trauma, isolation, and unlimited authority can combine to create destructive patterns helps us recognize similar dynamics in our own time and work to prevent them. Ultimately, this historical examination calls us to consider fundamental questions about power, accountability, and human dignity that transcend any particular historical period. How do we create systems that enable effective leadership while protecting both leaders and those they govern from the corrupting effects of unlimited power? How do we maintain human connection and accountability within hierarchical structures? How do we ensure that the most vulnerable individuals are protected rather than exploited? These questions, raised by our examination of imperial Rome, remain central to building just and sustainable societies. The tragic patterns we've documented serve as both warning and instruction, reminding us that the protection of human dignity must be central to any legitimate exercise of power. Through careful historical analysis combined with contemporary understanding of psychology and human rights, we can work to ensure that the failures of the past inform better choices in the present and future.